If you've done any sort of MIDI programming with brass and horns getting a poppy brass sound, then you know just how hard it is to make it not sound completely fake and lifeless. I'm going to fix that for you in this video. This is one of those very rare occasions where I will tell you that processing matters a lot. And if you watch my videos at all, you'll know that's something I don't say very often. But when it comes to brass, my own personal experience is that if you want amazing poppy brass, you usually are going to have to process it to get there. Even with really great samples like the Session Horns Pro samples, I've just found that I'm not able to get a very realistic sounding brass sound without having to do this. So first things first, if you want really amazing brass, then you do need to start with great sounding brass and horn samples. So if you're using those stock sounds in your DAW and praying to God that it's going to work, it's going to be significantly harder to make that work. You can definitely feel free to give it a shot though. So like I mentioned, I am using the Session Horns Pro by Native Instruments. I personally like these a lot. They sound really, really great. I know East West also has some really great sounding studio horns as well. But even though I'm using this, you can't just like whip up a sound and call it a day. There are going to be several steps that we're going to go through to get this from a pretty amateur sound to a very rich, full, and energetic sound. So let me just go ahead and show you what this sounds like when we're all said and done with the processing. So obviously that sounds fantastic. I'm going to show you how we got it there. Now, obviously what we need to start out with is a part that actually sounds great, which is the composition or the writing component, which for this video, we're going to kind of gloss over. But in short, if you write a part that is totally unrealistic, then you can't expect it to sound realistic. So this part that I wrote here is a very typical part for a nice brass section to play, just kind of jamming out, and it does sound really realistic. So what I want to do right now is actually show you what these horns sound like with absolutely no processing. So even though what I'm going to show you is going to be quieter, what you'll notice here is that we were peaking at -4.9 here with all the processing, a very nice loud part. And notice that we are going to actually be peaking at a higher level than the post-processing version, but it is quieter. And we're going to talk about how. Now, obviously, this does not sound bad, but to me, this is sounding relatively thin. It's not sounding nice and bright and wide, and it just doesn't sound super convincing to me. Now, before we actually jump into all of the effects and the plugins and stuff like that we're using, the very first thing we need to look at is actually the piano roll. Because when we're programming our brass, there are a few things that are really important. The very first thing is the articulation is really important. So as you can hear, when we have this note here, it's kind of doing this whole thing, and that is because I'm holding down these notes on the keyboard and the Native Instruments Session Horns. I have it set up so that when I have these longer notes that are played at a very loud dynamic level, it'll automatically kind of do this nice little swell, which is going to make it sound significantly more realistic. But you'll notice too, we have these notes that are overlapping right here, and then some notes that are not overlapping, like right here. And so in a moment where I want it to slur, da 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 da, 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 da. And then I have these staccato notes. So I'm being very, very specific and intentional about the actual way that I'm programming these parts. So these parts right here are going to kind of slur. This part's going to be detached, and these parts are obviously going to be more detached. So just really pay attention to the articulation and really pay attention to how the slurs and then the non-slurs are sounding. Bum, 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 bum. So things are very, very specific. The next thing is the velocities. Velocities are crucial, and you can see all this is red. And this means that all the velocities are pretty much the same. We're not having any instances where, you know, these velocities down here are like this, really soft and then loud and soft, because if you just perform it in, you're gonna have all these kind of discrepancies, and you need to go in and fix those discrepancies. So in this case, this was louder. This is a very shouty kind of brass section, and so I wanted to make sure that it was dynamically at that level. Obviously, if you're working on something where the dynamic level is a lot more variant, that's going to be done with the velocities, or it's going to be done with the mod wheel, which you can automate in time. So in my case right here, let's say that you're working with a library that does not automatically add the swells here. Well, you're either going to have to do this with volume automation, or you can jump into your modulation right in here, and then you can adjust that by doing maybe something around the lines of maybe like this. And this is going to essentially be the dynamic level of that part. Like I said, the Native Instrument stuff, I don't have to worry about that, so I'm not having to do that. But if you want to have a part that is a lot more dynamic, that's how you do it. Okay, so that's the programming part of this. Let's actually get into the effects, because obviously, like I said, right here, That's sounding good, but how do we get this nice, big, rich, and energetic sounding horns? As you can see here, we have a lot of different plugins, and this is not obviously a tutorial on how to actually use each and every one of these plugins. If you need help on like EQ and compression, I have a link in the description down below with a few videos that I've gone over those. But the very first thing that I did in the chain was to actually add some compression, and this compression is meant to just give a nice little squeeze. I'm doing about 5 dB of compression. You're going to see the needle move to about 5 dB with a 4:1 ratio here. And what you will notice is I have auto gain off, and so we are not adding any makeup gain. And then the last thing is, as you can see here on the distortion knob, I actually have this set to soft, and this is going to add a little bit of sizzle to it. Now here's without the compression. Here's with compression. And so really what this is doing is taking the loudest, snappy parts, and this is kind of bringing them down a little bit. And so this is going to help us get more of this perceived loudness that we're going to wind up with when we're all done. The second thing I did is added distortion. Now I'm using Decapitator, which is a Sound Toys plugin. This is probably the best sounding distortion in my opinion. However, if you're just using stock plugins in your DAW, you can use really any distortion plugin. And you can see the only thing that we're doing on this is two things. The very first is I'm driving at about 3.5, and then on the tone, I did make this just a little bit brighter on the tone side, and this is going to give us more of that sizzle and crunch. So here is without distortion. So far it's just compression. Here's without it. Here's with it. So this is obviously adding a nice little bit of grit and some sizzle and some fire on it. But again, this is not crazy. This is not over the top. When we're talking about something where we're going to be using a pretty good number of different plugins, this is about using each plugin to make about a 5% difference. This is not about going all in and overcompensating, because if you overcompensate, it is way more likely that you're actually going to hurt the sound than make it better. So if I were to be driving this at like 6 or 7, that's just way too much. But driving at about 3.5 is perfect for the taste that I'm going for. And one thing that I think is really important to mention is that in this particular case, I'm obviously going for a nice, bright, sizzly, fiery kind of poppy sound. So if you're doing a ballad, you're going to approach all this differently. So I'm focusing more on principles and less on, here, copy paste my particular signal chain, right? The next thing I'm doing is adding width, and this is by actually using a plugin called Thermal. Now this is actually a distortion plugin, but the only thing that I'm doing on this is jumping into here, going to width, turning the width on, and then basically adding all of this width. So you could use really any stereo imaging plugin. So Stereo Spreader is a plugin within Logic. It's a stock plugin. You could use that too, but I personally just think Thermal sounds awesome. So let's listen so far. We're going to turn this off. So here's what we have so far without Thermal, without that width. All right, here's with it. So obviously if you're wearing headphones or monitors, you'll be able to tell that just made it sound so much bigger and so much wider, but it's really not actually adding any volume. The next thing I did in here is added a little bit more compression. Now this is what's called serial compression, where we are using more than one compressor on one particular track to help give a much smoother type of compression, but add a little bit more compression. Now this is a 2A compressor, which is a much more smooth compression. Only doing a little bit of peak reduction. You're going to see here is only going to be about 1 to 2 dB. So it's a very, very insignificant amount, but this is just, again, taming out some of those peaks, which is going to help us get more of this perceived loudness. After the compression, I added some EQ, and in this particular EQ, I'm only adding a little bit around 600 Hertz, okay? And I'm only boosting it about 2.5 dB. So this is a very, very small amount of boost happening on this EQ. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I wanted to add a little bit more body. If we listen to this without the EQ, we've got a lot of brightness. There's a lot of sizzle, but I wanted to make sure that we are also balancing that out to have some of the mids coming out as well, because this is the main thing, and I want to make sure it's not sounding too harsh or too bright. So by adding just a little bit at 600 Hertz, here's what it sounds like. Now you need to be really careful with this, because if we're going to add too much of this, like if I were to add like say 5 dB, listen to this. That really does not sound very good. So you need to be very, very subtle with this decision here. So again, 5% decisions per plugin. And then the last thing I did on this was added some reverb, which I'm using Round, which is one of my favorite reverbs. I am using a 2-second decay, and then I'm mixing it in, 30-ish%. Now you could put this reverb on an effects channel and then send it to it. But in this particular case, since this is the only instrument using this reverb, I just put it directly on the channel. Here's what it sounds like now with the reverb. Now, if you remember back when we first did this without any of the effects, you'll notice that we were peaking at about -4 dB. And look at right now, the peak level is -5.5, which is over 1 dB less. Yet this is louder from a perceived standpoint. Let's go back to no effects. I think we can agree that does not sound louder. But yet if you look at the meters here, -2.5 dB, right? We're hitting like 4 dB louder. Now let's throw all this on again and listen. So -4.7, but yet I think we can all agree this sounds significantly louder, and this is the magic and beauty of using compression and distortion together to increase the perceived loudness. Now, I went through a lot of stuff here very quickly, so if you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comment section below, and if you have not already subscribed to the channel, I would highly encourage you to do so. If you like this video, trust me, you're gonna like my other videos. We'll see you in the next one.